If you understand your place in history, it can change your entire worldview and even your view of yourself. History is so much more personal when you start to learn it in the way that I'm teaching here on Deconstructing Patriarchy. In today's video, we are going to do exactly that. We're going to take everything we've learned in the first 9 videos and ask that really important, vital question. So what? How does this apply to me today, Holly? Why should I even care and watch these videos and think about these deep topics? Together, we're going to explore how knowing where you fit in history can feel like a freaking power move to help you rewrite your narratives and the narratives of the people around you. And why understanding, as we said in the last video, a wider lens of history feels so much more empowering. Why that is so key in this moment in time in 2025 as we're going through so much of what I'm talking about in these videos. Hello, if you're a new subscriber, welcome. And if you're not, welcome back. Thank you so much for taking your precious, precious time and getting a moment of sanity here with me, hopefully, and really getting to understand from a 50,000 foot vision what's happening in this day and age. I know all of us are losing our on a daily basis here, but the more I do this work and the more I center in this work, the more I'm able to stay grounded and stay centered and be able to breathe. So I invite you into this work. If you're new, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Make sure you hit that bell so you know when new videos come out, when we go live, and any other new fun things we're doing. If you know of somebody that could also benefit from this breath of everything else going on in the world, then please send them this video and give them a little reason as to why you think they might like this. One other reminder, if you're new and you haven't heard me say this yet, please go back and watch episodes 1 through 8. You can find those in season 1 playlist under the title Foundations to Deconstructing Patriarchy, History, and Myth. I usually say you can watch these as standalone episodes, which you can, but this episode in particular really built on the last few episodes, and those episodes are built on the previous ones. So the first 3 episodes, we looked at what patriarchy is in order to set up this idea of the patriarchal lens that I'm talking about. In episode 4, we talked about deconstruction and what that term means and how we're using it on this channel. And then starting with episode 5 through 8, we've been talking about how history is made and what myths are. Please go back and watch those. It's been really fun, and I hope you go back and grab that playlist. You'll bookmark it and you'll start to listen to all of these videos in order, because they do build on top of each other, and especially these last few videos are going to make so much more sense if you've watched the previous 8 or 9 videos in the series. So make sure you go hit that playlist. The link will be down below for you. Without further ado, let's jump into today's topic. History isn't just about what happened, it's about who's telling the history and what parts we remember and how those memories shape our current sense of self. When I learned how many voices were missing from history, it was a whole new freaking world. And it helped me to start questioning these gender roles and identities that we were given. You'll hear me talk about this more in my conversion to deconversion story in the next couple of episodes. As I started to read books like The Dance of a Dissonant Daughter, The Dark Mysteries of the Moon, alongside the creation of patriarchy that I keep mentioning, I started to understand the stripped away, culturized, civilized, dumbed down version, if you will, of history that had been taught to me and why it probably had been taught that way to women like me. And I started to see how this had affected me unknowingly my entire life. When I started to see what Gerda Lerner was doing or what Sue Monk Kidd was doing in their books, putting women and women's language back into history and helping them to become visible to me, a whole new world opened up. Gender roles created by Genesis and their relation to domestic abuse in my life began to have answers to the questions I'd been asking about my own marriage and the validity of a text that was never meant to be a map for women by women. How the submissiveness and the less than state of women to men in church, politics, and home came to be, and why I and so many religious women especially have a difficult time leaving abuse, asking for raises, equal pay, fair treatment, and etc. Here is the big one that you'll hear in my story that actually freed me. Why my body, especially my sexuality and my pleasure, had been abdicated to men and male gods without even me having given them consent or permission. And that this is why I never felt like my body was completely mine. And how many of us are walking around in this society with that exact same unconscious belief that allows things like the grape culture to exist and things such as that. As I learned, women had been part of the past, but duh for me for not even understanding that they had. I mean, I just even have a conscious understanding that I was missing that part of the past to actually ask the questions. Hey, where are the women? I think most of us just have glazed eyes as we go through our history classes and don't even stop to think, where are the women? We're at least 50% of the population. Why aren't we written into the history books? Anywho, I started to expand my language and thus ideas of what divine and holy could encompass, and understood why talking about a goddess or divine feminine had previously felt so dirty, heretical, or just plain wrong. When women are left out of the naming and language of sacred and holy areas of life, using language that reflects their experience and their bodies and their spiritual understanding of the world, it's another way we are taught to silence ourselves and to make ourselves small and unseen. When I realized this, it led me to start asking even more questions, such as, what did it mean to be a woman? Not defined by some men or some male god written by men, and not by women who were trying to adhere to that male version and that male god, but by real, tangible women who had gotten out of that world and defined themselves based on their own bodies, their own experiences, their own language. What did it mean to truly be a woman defined by women? Let me ask you this. What stories about your past have shaped your beliefs? Have you ever questioned who passed those stories down to you and what their bias or purpose was in passing those stories down to you about your family or your culture? And who prospered from those stories being taught the way that they were taught to disseminate the information to you that way? Big H history, as we talked about last week, is almost always exclusively taught from that male-centric patriarchal lens that I have been building with you now for 10 episodes. And it doesn't allow stories that don't fit in with that male-centric or support that male-centric point of view to be added to the Big H history. And remember, the Big H history is only the recorded and interpreted events from a bias. As I'm filming this, it's April of 2025, and we are actively seeing this happen in our day and age, where this current administration is currently wiping or hitting the big delete button in the database, the government websites for DEI. They're removing anybody that has been hired because it might be a DEI hire, and they're removing the voices of the past that don't fit this white male patriarchal centric view that they want to paint of the past. So it fits their very narrow version of what is a man and what is a woman and what is allowed in this country. I mean, we're seeing in real time what I keep talking about in these videos happening right before our eyes.
They're not just erasing the past, they're redefining the future for your children and for us. They're telling your children that loving this country means never asking questions, never naming the truth, never knowing your roots. Let's watch this.
Administration's also fighting to get critical race theory out of our school districts. Children will be taught to love America. Children will be taught to be patriots. Children will be taught civic values for schools that want federal taxpayer funding. So as we close the Department of Education and we provide funding to states, we are going to make sure that these funds are not being used to promote communist ideology.
This example came out last week, many weeks after I'd actually filmed this, but I had to get this in here because it's a perfect example as to what is happening in real time that I keep talking about. Let's break this down. Number one, this administration is fighting to get critical race theory out of our schools. Translation: they oppose any teaching that frames U.S. history through the lens of systematic racism, even though CRT as an academic framework is not taught in K through 12 schools. Dog whistle. We don't want kids learning that racism was or is a foundational part of American systems, and we cannot heal what we have not grieved, and we cannot grieve that which we do not actually understand or know because it's left out of our history. Number 2, children will be taught to love America. Translation, they want a curriculum that only highlights America's strengths, not one that includes historical critique or encourages questioning. Underlying idea there, indoctrination over critical thinking. Real time, they want to curtail the history to be very slanted to make their version look favorable and erase all of the rest. 3, children will be taught to be patriots. Translation, teaching loyalty to the nation as a core value, again, possibly over truth, complexity, or dissent. Not even just dissent, but just a disagreement in ideas. Note, patriotism in this context often excludes perspectives that challenge dominant power structures. Number 4, children will be taught civic values. Translation, vague statement, but likely refers to a version of civics that centers on obedience to authority, traditional structures, and nationalism, not grassroots activism or civil disobedience, nor anything that would fight the narrative that they want to paint. 5, for schools that want federal tax funding. Translation, they'll tie funding to compliance. Schools must teach their version of history and civics or risk losing money. 6, as we close the Department of Education. Translation, they want to eliminate the federal oversight of education entirely, letting states or politicians determine what's taught. 7, we're going to make sure these funds are not being used to promote communist ideology. Translation, they're equating any progressive, anti-racist, or inclusive education with communism. Classic tactic to demonize left-leaning ideas and make people afraid. Because when people are afraid, they don't tune in to criticisms of other things, they just discount them and they turn off their brain. So what's actually going on here? Rewriting history to glorify the US and avoid accountability. They're silencing marginalized voices and dissenting voices in scholarship about race, gender, or power. They're threatening funding to force ideological conformity. And they're framing dissenting ideas like CRT, equality, anti-racism as un-American or dangerous. Let's move on.
Another example I can think of is how many voices of the women from either the American Revolution or the French Revolution do we know? We might know some of the wives of the presidents, but that's about it. We don't know any of the women that were actively involved in helping us to get our freedoms. They've been just left out of history. When we can do what I was talking about in episode 4, which is deconstructing something, which is actually looking at the lens with which we have been able to interpret things in the past or interpret scriptures that we were taught were holy and righteous. When we can look at that lens and realize that lens is what's living in us. And if we take it off, we can begin to glimpse an extremely different story of history than the distant and personal one we were taught. We can make it come closer to us and give us purpose and meaning. We can ask questions such as, who benefits from this angle of telling this story? Why would they benefit? What previous stories did they possibly build their own story on? For this, I always think of Aristotle and Plato, like they were building on the stories that had gone on for about 2,500 years ahead of them that built this cultural DNA that women were less than, that they were the second sex. So then they just simply took those stories and wrote their story about gender. How is it helping them to maintain power, control, the societal structure of patriarchy? And how is the story potentially threatening or supporting the story of patriarchy? What is the result of the story being a threat or a support? As I've said a million times in these first 10 episodes, when we remove that patriarchal lens from our view, a whole new world opens up about history for us. When we recenter marginalized voices, whether it be women or other races and classes, new stories emerge with new possibilities to look at how the past might have unfolded, and they might even allow us to shift our view on some pivotal moments in history. Again, little h history, not big H history, but little h history. When we remove that lens, we also get to see new perspectives on the past and what shaped those events in the first place. And as I keep saying, give us hope for this present day because we have a wider angle lens to see everything with. History becomes usable in our present day life when we see it as more than facts. Side note, this is probably why our ancestors loved myth, because it took out that one-time event and made it an event that happens all of the time so that they could apply it to their lives. Myths make history applicable to our daily life. If you didn't get that from the other video when we talked about this. Anywho, history as we know it is taught more as a myth in this day and age because it's got that story, that interpretation part to it, and it puts a glaring spotlight on what a culture prioritizes while just ignoring the rest of the voices that wouldn't support a different narrative. For me, making history personal really came, as you heard at the beginning of this video, when I started to deconstruct, even though that's not what I knew I was doing and I didn't have this word for it. When I started to deconstruct these ideas and these beliefs, I started to see myself within history. I started to see myself as an active participant. I'm going to share a lot more about my conversion to deconversion story and even my journey through the toxic self-help world, which is just another version of the Christianity wrapped up in crystals and moon water. But for now, let me share a couple examples. When I started to tune back into politics in August of 2024, I had been listening to a podcast that I'll share down below, Believe It or Not. And in that, earlier in 2024, I'd listened to one of his podcasts about the pro-life movement and started to learn that the pro-life movement was actually rooted in the racist movement of the 1940s and 50s. That movement is allowing the Christian nationalist movement to proliferate right now in the fundamentalism that we talked about a couple episodes ago. Learning that side of history, learning the hidden side of history where the voices that had been marginalized or silenced.
I mean, seriously, look at this woman. Why is this not being written into powerful books that get turned into movies or straight to a screenplay? This just came into my awareness this week, but this is what happens when you start tuning in.
Allowed me to start this work in September of writing on my Substack, bringing in the creation of patriarchy, bringing in the dance of the dissonant daughter and all this stuff that I'd learned, and to start to build this curriculum for you. So a very real, tangible way of how, when I learned a wider angle of history, started to change my life. Another example, I'm writing the Sacred Tryst, this biblical historical fiction that is turning the idea of Christ on its head. It's giving us a new creation story, filling in the gaps of what wasn't told because, you know, again, history, big H history, is this small, but history is like, it's this big, it is huge. So I have a lot of leeway as a creative fiction writer to maybe get something right based on the little bit of history that I have and filling in the gaps with everything else. That's another way being active in this history making is personal. And lastly, here's another one that really came at the beginning of this journey for me when I was reading The Creation of Patriarchy, and I learned that women co-created patriarchy with men. It wasn't something that happened to women, but because women were most likely in a place of power at the start of this, they helped co-create it. Why do I mention that? Because as I've done things called red tents, which is bringing women together in a special environment that allows them to really drop into their body, honor their cycles, their bodies, their spirituality, their language, their divinity, as I would teach it to them in those spots or in those spaces, they would start to feel empowered. When we learn that we helped co-create something, we feel more empowered. We drop that idea that we're just the victims of this and that we have power to help co-create something to get out of this. I hope you can see with my personal examples of applying this to my own life that if you really go back and listen to these episodes again and again and again and really start to embody, to internalize the messages that I have for you here, and then continue on with me as we go into the next seasons, that you can also make your mark in history, whether it be just in your family or community level or more on a global level like I'm doing. If you want to join me, let me know. You can help me with just sharing this information. That's a way you can start to impact history right now by sharing this information with your network and your community. Let me give you another personal example. By understanding understanding where the idea of gender roles came into being, where they started to develop in history, you can start to challenge the heteronormative ideas of the myths that we are taught in this present day and age, and know that you're okay doing that. You're not bumping up against some religious doctrine or God or going against this God. You're just trying to take a wider angle lens. If you are still spiritual, great. Maybe your God just needs to get bigger. I was part of Menlo Park Presbyterian where John Ortberg was the head pastor, and that's what he would say all the time. Is your God big enough? Is your idea of God big enough to be as compassionate and as loving and as all-encompassing as a divine being should be? One that doesn't see us as genderized, but just sees us as souls. I know for me, I hear this in my conversion to deconversion story, learning about the gender roles really helped me to get out of abusive situations and identify them going forward a lot faster, because it's still sometimes hard. You still get duped. Even 15 years out, I can still get duped. But I identify them a lot faster now because I work with this material all the time, and I have really strong boundaries and ways to pull back and get myself centered and safe. No matter what, learning about history, applying the lens theory I have developed for you to it, and asking those tough questions can help you to deconstruct what you've been taught or just simply believe, because it's out there in the zeitgeist. By you applying this method, you are not only actively deconstructing, you are helping to build a new future. Just as we learned back in episode 5 with Maurice Halbach, he said, collective memory is essentially a reconstruction of the past that adapts the image of historical facts to the beliefs and spiritual needs of the present. Again, I'm just pointing out the facts that you can do this work with me and not be anti-spiritual or anti-Christian. This is what people have done for all of time with the scriptures. And it's okay to do that. We need everyone doing this in order to help create new creation stories or new versions of creation stories that allow for a wider angle lens to be more inclusive of who humanity truly is. Let's look at what humanity truly is first and foremost, and then write the stories instead of writing the stories and forcing humanity to fit in that box. I want you to think about a way that you could possibly help spread this message and do this work in your own life. I just gave you one, right? Spread the message, share these videos, share them with your friends, send them out in emails, send them out in text. Let people know this work is here. It is very unique and it's not picking up super fast on the algorithm, but I believe in it, and so many people that have found me already also really believe in this work. So that's one way you can be an active participant in history making, being our ancient future selves. There's also other ways. Are you a writer? Are you a creator of any sort? Well, we're all creators of all sorts, but what other way can you help to recreate, to adapt the past to the needs of the present? Be thinking about that. Share them in the comments with me, and let's get this conversation started. I'm limited in my own view. I know you all have so many more ideas, and I'm here to hear them. I am here for that. We've talked about history. We've talked about myth. We've talked about the patriarchal lens that these two things are taught and seen through. So what's next? What happens when we apply all three of these to one of the most influential texts of all times? Yep, that's right. In the next episode, we're turning toward the Bible, not to debate belief, but to unpack how patriarchy shaped what was written, what was left out, and what we've come to believe as truth. Was the Bible a historical document, a sacred myth, a patriarchal blueprint? We'll ask, how much of the Bible is history and whose version? How did myth and cultural memory shape its stories? And most importantly, who benefits from the way we've been taught to read it? Because understanding the biblical history through this wider angle lens that I keep talking about isn't hearsay, it's healing. If you made it this far, thank you. We've made it through the meat of the season. We have made it through the foundations of deconstructing patriarchy, history, and myth. Woo! Make sure you celebrate. If you haven't gone back and watched the first 9 episodes, please do that. And then keep watching these. The more you're in these videos, the more you're drinking in this material and getting accustomed to this language and giving yourself permission to take off that very narrow little lens and put on a wider angle lens for history, or no lens. Just allow all of it to come in, because it's all part of that little H history, all of the unrecorded and recorded past. We'll be able to get ourselves out of the mess that has been created. in this current day and age. Love you all so much. Thank you for joining me for this work. I will see you in the next one. So long. Toodaloo. Ciao, ciao. Adios. Bye-bye.